I believe that what happened in Egypt was the first time that spin doctors existed. Consider this. Forgotten were the details of the 10 plagues brought about by God due to Pharaoh's stubbornness. It was not politically correct in Pharaoh's court to remind Pharaoh of such things. So the Egyptian wise men who wanted to keep Pharaoh happy and their jobs intact invented a concept of spin. Now, the word spin means to rapidly turn the truth 180 degrees. Now, according to the politically correct atmosphere in the palace, the Hebrews were to be portrayed as the villains, whatever the fact, because Pharaoh chose to think of himself as the victim. He had now developed a victim mentality, and he pointed to the coffin of his firstborn son as evidence as to he being mistreated and deserved to be pitied. So the spin created by the Pharaoh's advisors probably went something like this. The Hebrews have always never been anything but trouble, trouble, trouble. They were bad, evil people. All Egypt's problems were their fault. The economic and the emotional catastrophes the nation and its people had suffered had nothing to do, according to the new political correctness movement, with Pharaoh's pride. After all, he was really very humble, extremely reasonable, and he just wanted to be respected and obeyed. Now, if that's the case, the truth was exactly 180 degrees backwards. But you must understand, things weren't going very well in Egypt at the moment, and the Egyptian cabinet members reasoned, a little chariot ride for genocide always makes the Pharaoh feel better. So the die was cast. A few days after children left Egypt, it looked like they were wandering aimlessly in circles. God was leading them with a pillar of a cloud by day and with a pillar of fire by night. But as comforting as that thought is, gradually a nagging feeling is beginning to set in. With all of the walking that they are doing, they're not getting anywhere. They are not putting much distance between them and Egypt. You know, God did not send them up the coastal highways toward the land of their forefathers. It would have taken about 3 days. But if he had, they would have ran into Egyptian garrisons. Instead, he was leading them back and forth, a pattern just outside the borders of Egypt. You know, it's almost as if God was using this continued presence in the area to taunt Pharaoh. And if you keep on reading the scriptures, you'll find out that was exactly what he was doing. God was not through with Pharaoh yet. And that means neither were the children of Israel. Now consider this. There is a process that redeemed slaves must go through. It is the process of deprogramming, what we might call renewing of the mind. This is a continuing, ongoing, progressive process. For every deliverance that is experienced, there must follow a period of soul searching, of questioning everything that has happened, of wondering what is coming next, and then what did it all mean. And at this same time, negative thoughts and attitudes are going to surface. Sarcasm is going to come out, and ugly emotions that have been repressed for years are going to find its expression. Please understand, this stage is a necessary part of transitioning from a slave mentality, which is to coerce surrender of their will to the dominance of another person, to the point where they can freely and voluntarily surrender their will to God. Now, what brings about this necessary and unpleasant stage? You know, it's not about celebrating freedom that brings the people to the point of overcoming the slave mentality. It is facing the crisis. Now, enter Pharaoh's 600 chariot brigade. Stage left. One big-time life crisis is about to come up right on cue. The soul-searching and questioning of this redeemed slave population is just beginning. There's another phase that's about to begin. We talk about the concerns of the present crisis. Now let's compare the present crisis to the past. There is inherited in this process for the children of Israel and for all today who received God's deliverance a "I told you so" component. Here is what I'm talking about. Pharaoh is going to react to seeing Israel wandering around just outside his borders by deciding that if he cannot have them as slaves, no one will, and he will issue a decree of death for them. He will gather his 600 war chariots, head off in hot pursuit, and with mayhem on his mind, he will catch the children of Israel with their backs to the sea of reeds. And then he will lick his chops with relish as he sees their helpless position. Then he's going to charge forth with intent to maim, kill, and wreak as much havoc and hell on earth as one man in charge of an army of murderers possibly can. However, before Pharaoh can release his fury on the children of Israel, Yud-Heh-Vah-Heh is going to prove his worth as their covenant partner one more time. He will actually move before their eyes and reposition his protective pillar of fire so that they will create a barrier that cannot be crossed between them and the Egyptian army. And then that will stop the mightiest army on earth dead in his tracks. But that is just the beginning of what God's going to do for them. Moses' reply to the children's complaints, questions, and bitter sarcasm teaches us how to deal with the spin masters and the complainers among us. It is written in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 and 14, "And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, stand still, and see the salvation, the Yeshua of the Lord, which I will show you today. For the Egyptians whom you've seen today, you will see them again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." Now, after turning the attention of people away from the spin that existed from the blame placers, he focuses their eyes back onto God, where it belongs. And Moses is now in a position to receive strategic instructions from God's throne, who was not about to let his children go back to Egypt. It is never enough in God's eyes for his people just to walk a few steps away from slavery. He always insists on burning the bridges behind them. He always arranges the circumstances that are necessary to show them and us very clearly that there is nothing worthwhile to go back to. God is not just taking them out of slavery and setting them free. He is taking them unto himself as a bridegroom takes a bride. And heaven help the Pharaoh or anyone who tries to pry them or us out of his hand. You know, after dealing with some understandable concerns from the children of Israel, Moses tells them to stand and see the deliverance of our God. Then, in response to God's instructions, he stretches out his hand over the sea and that blocks the escape from Pharaoh's army. And then a strong wind immediately begins to blow. And right in front of their eyes, the sea will divide in two. And that divided waters will then form a wall on each side. And right before their eyes, the seabed will become dry ground. And he will make a way for them that seemed there was no way. And he still does that for us today. This large community of Israel and mixed multitude which joined Israel out of Egypt will soon find itself passing miraculously through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Then they will all watch in horror as God removes that protective barrier of his cloud and fire and lets the Egyptian army pursue them, horses, chariots, and all, into that pathway between those two walls of water. Pharaoh's decision to attack what seems a helpless multitude with all the force of his 600 chariots will prove to be a fatal miscalculation. God caused the walls of water to collapse on the Egyptian army, burying the Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and soldiers in a watery grave. The Egyptians that had seemed so totally in control of the children of Israel's destinies a few moments before will vanish from the earth in an instant as the children of Israel looked back at total shock and awe. And what was the result? It was written in Exodus chapter 14, verse 31, and Israel saw the great work which the Lord did to the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. Consider this. The change you went through when you accepted Yeshua as your Savior can be compared to the events of Pharaoh and the children of Israel. Does this sound familiar to you? The transition from unbelief to faith for me was like night and day. I had been miserable, dealing with depression, and I found out later suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. But when I asked God to forgive me for what I have done to his reputation, and I asked Yeshua in my life, everything changed. The panic attack stopped, but it took over a year for my wife to believe that I'd changed. In the beginning, everything was great, but the life became difficult again. Why? The difficulties I was facing was different from what I had had. I learned a lesson. While my faith in the Messiah eliminated a set of problems, it also created a whole new set. Has that ever happened to you? This is exactly what the people of Israel had to learn when they left Egypt. For hundreds of years, they endured the oppression and forced servitude from Pharaoh. Their sufferings can be applied to the bondage that all of us face when we are under the control of sin, evil, and death. Now, the pain that they experienced under slavery completely controlled their lives. Then the bondage of control was broken, and they were set free. God, through signs and wonders, changed the people's status from slaves to free people, and they left Egypt no longer obligated to submit to Pharaoh's oppressive rule. But the moment that Israel was no longer Pharaoh's slaves, they became his enemies. Once he could no longer hold them captive, he pursued them. This was a problem they never had before. This was a new problem that did not last long, but once this problem of Pharaoh and the army was eliminated after the crossing of the Red Sea, they had to face another new set of problems as God began to lead them through the wilderness. Now, if you continue reading the Torah, you will find out that they perceived that their new problems were far worse than their old ones under Pharaoh. They quickly forgot how terrible it was. Does that sound familiar? Now, one of the reasons why we struggle with our new difficulties is because we are often not adequately prepared for them. When I was first told about the difference Yeshua would make in my life if I received him, I was given the impression that I would be happy from that time on. And when the new difficulties came, it became a crisis for me. I doubted my salvation. I share this part of my life to tell you this. If you have a similar expectation that following Yeshua is all about, then you will be offended by the struggles you may be going through. I am sorry if you, for one reason or the other, had a mis-expectation of what it means to know God. But let me give you a more accurate picture, the one given to us by God himself in the story of Israel's release from slavery. Faith in Yeshua is not about the freedom of life's difficulties. It's about being freed from the oppression in order that we might become his agents of freedom for others. The things that troubled us when we were slaves to sin need no longer control us. But those things that trouble us now as believers are different. The hardships of the past are due to the slavery of sin and evil under the ruleship of the devil when we were on our way to hell. But the hardships of today, if you are a true believer, are because of God's work in and through your life, the fruit of which is life everlasting. To truly understand this process, a word has to be redefined. And it is written in Psalm 91, verse 1, "He that dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty." The word image in Hebrew means shadow. God's shadow is not disconnected like Peter Pan. The shadow is so attached to the body that when the body moves, so does the shadow. This is the process that God uses when we become his. He is redesigning us to build us up in the image, the shadow of his son, Yeshua. Shalom.